Well, we are live now, so thank you for joining us. We're really excited to be chatting with Mike Selden of Finless Foods. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it.
So, I think before we kind of jump into the topics of space, maybe for those who might not be familiar with Finless Foods or the cell ag scene, tell us a little bit about Finless Foods.
Yeah, for sure. So Finless focuses on alternative methods of production of seafood. So we started off just doing cellular agriculture, focused entirely on tuna, with bluefin tuna as our beachhead. So that means that we have taken cells from a real bluefin tuna, have pulled them into our lab and built them up into cell lines. And the idea is that we can then take those cells and make them into sashimi that is on a cellular level the same thing that people are eating today. We can produce sashimi without mercury, without plastic, without environmental destruction, and without having to kill animals. We now don't have to go back to a tuna ever again now that we have these cell lines established. And we are currently in the middle of constructing our pilot facility. And so we think we can be a good move for the environment in producing all of these things. In the meanwhile, we're working on regulatory approval right now. We're going to be launching an entirely plant-based product in 2 weeks, which I'm really excited about. And that will also be tuna, but in a different form factor and with a bunch of different things about it. But we're really excited, basically. We want to try and make a difference for the ocean. And we think with our technology, we have a pretty good argument that we can do that.
Cool. And that plant based product will be available pretty soon, right?
Yeah, very soon. We're going to be launching it at the National Restaurant Association in Chicago in 2 weeks.
Wow, 2 weeks. Okay, cool, awesome. Well, that's super exciting, and I guess for those listening, Finless is definitely one of those kind of key players in the seafood space when it comes to cellular agriculture. But one thing that's quite unique about Finless, I think, is that Finless Foods was one of the first companies to run an experiment in space. And so maybe I have a laundry list of questions to ask, but maybe how did those conversations start?
Yeah, it's really funny. This whole industry used to be tiny. Like we were the first cell cultured seafood company. We were the third cell cultured meat or seafood company of any variety. Now there's over 60 that are well funded globally. But basically, what I mean by bringing that up is that it used to just be that if you worked in this industry, we all knew each other. And Alex, you probably remember those days. You also knew everyone in the industry. Now that's not really possible, which is cool. But basically, there's this fantastically brilliant scientist whose name is Shaked. Really smart guy, been working in this industry for a really long time, networks really well, and just a great ideas person. And he reached out and got in contact with me saying hey, I'm in contact with the Russian space program. And actually, I should probably ask him how that ended up happening. But he was saying they're looking for cell culture companies to go up there. And so he got plugged in. And so the Russians were already in contact with Aleph Farms. And so they're well, we're going to be sending some meat to space. We would also like to send some seafood to space. So we worked with them in terms of um, making that happen. And so through them, we were the first fish to ever be grown in space. I originally didn't see this company as a company that had anything to do with space. We're focused really on the environment and on animals. But I've had this said to me now a few times, which is that this cellular agriculture is really the only way that we're ever going to make meat in space. It's really arduous to get things into orbit, and to pull things up there that are as massive as, say, a cow is already extraordinarily difficult. To get something like a tuna, which is a 6 foot long apex predator, like one of the fastest things in the ocean, with all the water required to actually have it have enough space to move around, is basically impossible. And so this is certainly the only way that we're ever going to make seafood in space. So it's really exciting to be part of that project with the Russian Space Agency.
Great. And so, what was so obviously there's a lot of things that could be done in the laboratory here on Earth. What was the general purpose of the experiment in space? Was it cell culture? Was it something else?
Yeah, there's this company called 3D Bioprinting, and basically they have developed a new type of 3D printer for biological constructs that they already have up on the ISS. And so they were saying, well, we've used this to print small tissue constructs for medical purposes before. They would like for this to be a thing that can be used in medical practices on Earth, but also medical practices in space. 3D printers are really an important technology for space because you have very limited resources. So you want basically something that can make a whole bunch of things to take up a very minimal amount of space. And just to send up the raw ingredients and materials or eventually to like grow them in space or on another planet. Um, and so they were like, well, we want to test this out and see if it works for meat. And so this bioprinter does work on Earth, but there are very different conditions when you're working without gravity. Cells are very like interested in clumping together, which can be good in certain situations and cause problems in other situations. So it's a thing that you have to have under tight control. And so what you're dealing with in terms of the like mechanics of the place you're growing these cells and assembling them is very important. So on Earth, we have a very specific set of impellers, which is like a propeller, but it's not propelling anything; it's inside of something, um, mixing things around inside of a bioreactor, which allows for the proper amount of clumping and not clumping in gravity. And so the question is like, can we adapt these systems to a low gravity or no gravity environment? So that was what was interesting for them. For us, I mean, I was just more interested in trying out this bioprinter. It's a technology that we had not used before. It uses a very specific set of things that I thought were really interesting that we had not experimented with. And they're basically saying like, hey, you can do this experiment for free as long as it happens in space. And we were like, that sounds great. We'll do that. And in the meanwhile, we sort of helped make history. We were the first people to grow or put together really any sort of fish in space. On top of that, and I mean, this is sort of more relevant of a topic than ever. We wanted this to be sort of like a message and have a little bit of a political thing. The Russian part of the ISS has this bioprinter on it, which is really fascinating, but they don't have a suspension bioreactor, which is how you actually grow the cells out to create more of them. Their bioprinter just assembles the cells into tissue structures. Now, the US side of the ISS has a suspension bioreactor, but does not have a bioprinter. And so we really wanted this to sort of be a message of like, hey, we should be scientifically collaborating a lot more. Russia and the US have like a really troubled history, especially going back before, when it was the USSR. And so we'd like to try and like mend that a little bit. And I think today that's more relevant than ever. This experiment happened right around like 2018, 2019. So it was before this like most recent flare up. But I still have hope that we can end up scientifically collaborating with other countries, even where there are political disagreements between our governments.
I think from a political standpoint, it's very very interesting, as you mentioned, in terms of kind of like some of the results from running that test. Were you able to? I guess were the results substantial enough to where you would be able to take it back to Earth and maybe kind of do things differently or maybe have a different perspective?
Yes, I mean, so we were able to assemble microtissue structures, which like were done at like an impressive level of efficiency. I really, really appreciated like the speed by which their printer operates. And so now we're looking at like, okay, like we got up to microtissue, like can we build this into macro tissue using this type of system? And so that's the thing that we're still working on today. But basically, the results were that like this system does work for fish cells, which we assumed would happen. Fish cells are not like radically different, but they are different. They have different requirements for a bunch of different from a bunch of different perspectives. Everything from like the media that you're feeding them to the temperatures that they require, to like the ways in which they are assembled, the different like ratios of cell types to each other, and everything from just like I don't know, even like basic things like polarity of like what you need in order to assemble things. It's all just different, and so this was a really like great proving out that like we can use the same type of bioprinter systems that not only the meat companies use, but that 3D organ printing companies use with like human tissue. So all that stuff was really great. Now, anyone who's listening to this who is a scientist knows that like no experiment works the first time. And so like, we set up this great like plan of research where we'd be assembling like full on like thick tissue structures. That obviously did not work. We knew it wasn't going to. But I'm really impressed at like how far it did get, and it really bodes well for us continuing this research on Earth that we can assemble it even in this like really bizarre environment that we've done just like no work in whatsoever.
I'm gonna in a second. I'll ask you about like if you had the opportunity to do more in space, what you would do. But actually, first, one topic of discussion that has been coming up a lot for kind of this year's Astro is the logistics in regards to the payload. And most of the time, what we see is people kind of send a package somewhere, and then that's the package that gets fitted onto some sort of kind of standardized device and then sent up. In the case of the experiment, did you guys, where did you guys send something? Did you go somewhere? What was that process like?
Yeah, so the process was really around troubleshooting. So, there are scientists above the ISS, and they have to work with our cells. And fish cells are different, require a bunch of different things. And we found that especially people who like are very experienced at cell culture, um, they'll kill fish cells like pretty easily the first like handful of times they work with them because they have a lot of assumptions baked in on how they have handled cells in the past. And it's different. It's not like harder or easier. It's just different. And so, it was a process of like sending them over to the lab, the Russian lab that was on Earth, and like, walking them through all the different troubleshooting steps to make sure that they understood how to actually culture these cells before they took things up to space. In terms of actually sending things to space, it was pretty minimal. We only really sent, vials of cells, which are very small, frozen, and that was like the easy part. What was difficult was teaching people remotely who were in Russia how to culture fish cells over the phone, over email, over Zoom. Um, it's challenging. Even onboarding people to Finless is challenging, like teaching them how to do it in person. So this is a really great experiment on like, can we teach people to culture fish cells remotely? And so that was a really useful set of protocols for us, especially because when we were establishing our bluefin cell lines, we really needed to do that. We were collaborating scientifically across multiple different geographies. Finless had labs across the planet. We had one in Europe, we had one on the east coast of the US, and we had one in Asia. And all of these labs needed to collaborate with each other and coordinate their data in order to actually build the cell lines that are now or workhorse cell lines that we're scaling up in our pilot facility. So this was a really cool exercise in just like, how do you instruct someone from far away to do this very complex and new task? So it helped get our protocols really in shape. And for even just that reason, it was really useful.
That's cool, and I love actually, the connection you made that, from a protocol standpoint, it's helping you guys here. So I think for those of maybe not the people that are listening here, but a lot of people oftentimes say like, oh, space, why space? This is a great use case to say that, hey, this is something where maybe unexpectedly you're going to have really great optimizations in place. And so, leading back to that question, if you did have the opportunity to do more in space, what would you do, or how would you do it differently?
I would try again. I mean, I would like to try and assemble macro tissue structures. Space is a great place to do experiments. I mean, not the least of which is just that the experiments that are done there are always just kind of by their nature so ridiculously expensive that like the cost that we have for doing experiments, no one even thinks about. It's just like a totally different way of thinking about money that's just on a much bigger scale. And so I understand why people like test things out for space first. Like this is an expensive technology, and there are a lot of like industries that are like us, and that it's like a very high tech thing. The costs are going to end up coming down. Ours right now are like our bluefin cells, for example, just got below restaurant prices last year, and we need to continue working on them in order to get them below wholesale prices now. And so doing experiments in an environment where like high cost is expected and high cost is just like not really a big deal one way or another is a really helpful way to start developing your technology, as long as you have a method by which you can apply this to space travel and apply this to eventual human move towards the stars. um, the space community is really willing to have you in. Like I don't know, I've given a talk at like a bunch of different space conferences now, because we have this really fantastic investor called Hemisphere. They focus really on space completely. Um, and at these conferences, I find people who are really interested in our technology because, this is the only way to make meat in space. And they're very welcoming. I have always been like, hey, I don't know a lot about space travel, the ISS, kind of any of this, so you have to help me through it. So any Q&A session that I have is very collaborative with the audience. But even with them, I've gotten like a lot of ideas of like next experiments to do in space. Everything from, can we actually get ourselves into that suspension bioreactor on the US side of the ISS? Can we collaborate with NASA on that and actually have like a closed system that is producing meat on the ISS rather than just we send up cells, the Russians assemble them? I would love to like send up cells, have the Americans grow them, and then have the Russians assemble them into larger structures. I think that would be a really, really cool thing, especially nowadays.
So, the next question is really like, what kind of future do you envision for cell ag in space? But I'll give you a little bit more of a direct question too. Maybe that now that we're seeing space tourism is at least being discussed and planned for in much more ways than previously thought. Can you imagine that there could be like a Finless Foods type of meal on a SpaceX or a Blue Origin flight?
Yes, that would be awesome. I mean, the our cost structure is already like way underneath like pretty much anything that they're eating in space now. Like it's so expensive to get food up there that like we're already basically where we're at, by my understanding, cost effective to like make in space. At least like on par with like all the other things that are being eaten up there. So yeah, I could see this as like a really cool part of space tourism. It's like, maybe that's the first place that a lot of people get to eat cell cultured meat. Although well, actually, my understanding is that space tourism is much further away than like our, projected launches given regulatory timelines. But still, it like could be a really cool thing. Maybe like new products would launch in space first because the cost structure works better, and then eventually would trickle down to being a thing that Earth people consume.
There was a figure that was mentioned on one of the previous sessions where I think a bottle of water to get to the ISS costs around $10,000. So I can totally see that reaching price parity is on a different scale.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like the cost of just getting it up there is so ridiculous. So it's like, all we really need to send up is this like, small vial of cells. From there, I would also like to have experiments where people are growing the media ingredients in space. There are a lot of like horticultural experiments on the ISS, by my understanding. And so it's like, well, could we get the ingredients that we need from the media for the media from plants on the ISS and fermentation processes on the ISS? Um, that might make this like a lot cheaper than sending up, for example, a $10,000 bottle of water.
Exactly. So there was there was a study done by NASA. I want to say either early 2000s, I think early 2000s, and about growing goldfish cells in space. And actually, I've pulled an excerpt from a blog post from Avery Parkinson, a contributor to Protein Report, among some other online cell ag blogs and websites. And she has a blog post entitled, Eating Goldfish in Space, which actually goes through the history of cell ag. So I'll just kind of read this snippet on the goldfish. And so it's 2001. So it was early 2000. So 2001, NASA cultures meat. In 2001, NASA conducted an investigation into lab grown meat as a potential way to feed astronauts during space travel. And then this is quite a funny part. She kind of leads on by saying, because somehow anything can be applied to space travel, right? Here we are talking about cell ag in space. And then she goes on to say, in partnership with Morris Benjaminson of Touro College, they were able to culture goldfish muscle and later turkey cells. However, because culturing meat was very expensive, again, this is 2001, it wasn't feasible to continue the experiments in the space program. Have you come across this experiment? Was there any data that you guys saw? Is it a discussion topic that you've ever had, considering it's not tuna, but it is fish?
Oh yeah, this was one of the only papers that existed prior to Finless, um, and so we've come across it. I mean, like it's very light in terms of the research that was done, but it is like the first example of anybody culturing fish cells, even though it's goldfish. And if you look at the end of the paper, a question that I've had for the people who did it, are like, did they actually eat it? Because in the paper it does say that they just smelled it and that it smelled like fish and that they didn't eat it. Um, but I feel like someone has to have eaten it. I've tried. So someone who was in this research group and who actually participated in this is Alan Perlstein. I'm not sure if you know him, but he's the CEO of, for those listening, he's the CEO of California Cultured, which does cell cultured chocolate. And before that, he was the CEO of Miraculex. So it's funny. I mean, I ran into him at IndieBio, the accelerator that we both went through, and he was like, "You're doing cell cultured fish? I did that." And like started talking to me about this paper, and I was just like, "Yeah, of course I know that paper." So that was a really fascinating thing. So if you want like the ins of like what that was like, I'd get him on the show. Um, and the paper itself, yeah, I mean, there was like already in there, they were testing out different media formulations. They were doing things like trying mushroom media, which, wasn't a thing that had occurred to us prior to reading that paper. So, it was a very early paper. It was done a long time ago. But even just that it existed, I mean, we used that often in our early pitches, saying like, hey, we're not the first people to have ever done this. This was here prior. It got shut down. It seems like due to funding stuff more than like the project's success or failure. It seems like they did grow fish cells, and then they even assembled them. And they used like a really interesting method of assembly. If I remember this paper correctly, they like took fish chunks as like an explant, and then like they had the cells assemble themselves on the fish chunks. So the fish chunks were like giving off signaling, telling the cells how to assemble into something closer to meat. And so what that shows or indicates is that like, well, there is a way that you can signal to these cells to assemble in the correct way, and that signaling can be like loose in media, and it can still function and still actually assemble cells in a way that resembles meat. um, that's kind of big, like that means that like there's a way to do this artificially, very directly and much sooner than we think than people thought at the time. So I'm really happy that paper exists, and I would love to get more contact with some of the people who are on it. So far I've only met Alan.
Wow, that's exciting, and yeah, maybe something to dig deeper into. I actually run into Alan quite a bit, and recently tried some of his cultured California chocolate. So I've never talked to him about the goldfish. So maybe something I definitely need to bring up. As I close off, I just we've had actually many great examples about why it's important to work on and discuss these types of experiments and things like that in space. But I want to close off and really just kind of direct the question to you, maybe any other reasons maybe we didn't talk about. Why is it important to talk about the food that we'll be eating in space?
I mean, space has always been the forefront of technology. Like like we've never really developed technology in as fast paced of a way or in as thorough of a way as when we as a species are pointing towards the stars. And I really think that like the sort of gutting of NASA and like the taking away of public funding from space research has been a real detriment. I think people see it as like a frivolous thing, or see it as like not necessary or not helpful. But like if we're learning how to like change the environment on Mars, for example, to be inhabitable for human life, that's really going to be useful as climate change becomes more and more of a thing. Like we're going to need to learn how to terraform Earth in order to make it like a place that we can live given the trajectory that we're on today. And yeah, it's a great place for public funding, and like so much deep research happens in the public sector. I think there's definitely a narrative around private companies being the place where innovation happens. I would say private companies are the place where engineering happens, and the place where science happens is mostly in the public sector. For us as private companies, our job is just to take public research that's been done with public money and to attempt to commercialize it. But research direction like should be academic, when done at the base level. Like it should be a thing that's not directly pointed towards a use. It should be exploratory. It shouldn't be immediately focused on profit. It should be focused on just like exploring new areas of science and building information that can then eventually be used to benefit humanity. And space travel and space research like really encourages that. And so I think it really is important beyond all the things that other people talk about, which is also important, which is like it's important to dream, it's important to like inspire young scientists. I mean, like what scientist was not at least a little bit inspired by sci-fi? What scientist was not at least a little bit inspired by the idea of NASA, or whatever the space program is that's nearest to them, or closest to their country? um, that's obviously really key, but beyond that, it's like it's a place where public funding can go in order to actually do this deep research that benefits us on Earth as well. um, I'm very much in favor of just like all solutions at once, especially when fighting something like climate change. And I think that space research can be a really important part of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that kind of concludes our session. And I think I could not have closed it out better myself. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alex. This is great.